oppressed, they waited until then before they cried out to him. And man, God has a very strong word for his people, because right after that, man, God says to them, you know what, why don't you cry out to the gods that you've turned to? He says, go and cry out to the gods. This is in verse 14. He says, go and cry out to the gods you've chosen. He said, let them rescue you in the hour of distress. Now, beloved, we're living in an hour of distress. And unfortunately, there are many people, even God's people, who have turned to the idols of pleasure. And in this season, they're given over to just pursuing pleasures. And in Judges chapter 10, it says that they abandoned God. And I believe that's going on right now. I believe that, man, this is real talk from the heart. There are people who haven't been to church since this whole COVID thing hit. And instead, they've been chasing pleasure. They've been pursuing pleasure this whole time. They talk about being afraid to go to church because they don't want to, expose themselves and pick up any viruses. But yet they're posted up at Costco, hundreds of people, or wherever these other places are. They're gathered with all kinds of people. But for all practical purposes, they've really abandoned God, and they are pursuing the idols of pleasure. And yet they're going to wait until that hour of distress, and then they're going to finally cry out to God. And just like here in Judges 10, man, God would say to them today, man, he would say, why don't you go cry out to your boat? Why don't you go cry out to your camper? Why don't you go cry out to your toys? Let them rescue you in the hour of distress. Beloved, we can't treat God like a spare tire. We can't wait until drama hits. We can't wait until crisis hits before we finally cry out to God. Crying out to God should be a normal part of our lives. Why? Because we're in love with him. Because we're in love with him, and we are grateful and thankful for what he's done for us in our lives. Beloved, let's not be like the people here in Judges chapter 10, who are doing evil in the sight of God, pursuing pleasure, being lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, which is definitely a mark of the end times. Beloved, let's cry out to God. And we see what's going on in our land. We see what's going on in our land. We need to be people who are crying out to God and not pursuing the pleasures of this life, being pleasure chasers. We need to be God chasers in these last days. That's what the world needs from God's people. It's people who are chasing God and crying out for the land. Let's be people who are standing in the gap, interceding for lost souls, interceding for people who are wandering away from God, people who have abandoned God. Beloved, this is